August 1945. The air on the captured island was a shroud woven from coral dust, the metallic tang of dried blood, and the ghost of cordite. It clung to the skin, a gritty, final testament to a world that had ended. For the group of Japanese women, nurses whose hands were stained with the memory of futile work, clerks whose ledgers were now meaningless ash, civilians whose homes were craters under a hostile sun, the world had not merely ended, it had been inverted. They sat huddled on the scorched earth near a makeshift pier, a silent congregation of the defeated, their kimonos and work garments tattered into a uniform of surrender. Their internal landscape was a mirror of the external devastation, a wasteland of shattered certainties. For years, their minds had been fortresses, built brick by brick with the mortar of imperial propaganda. They were the children of a divine emperor, their spirit an unbreakable sword. The enemy, the Americans, were oni, ogres, clumsy and brutknockoutish brutes with hairy bodies and grotesque faces, fueled by a barbaric rage. The caricatures were etched into their consciousness, buck-toothed, pig-nosed monsters who lacked the discipline, the purity, the very soul of the Japanese people. To be captured by such creatures was the ultimate defilement, a stain upon the spirit that could only be cleansed by death. The small cyanide vials some had failed to use felt like cold, heavy condemnations in hidden pockets, reminders of a final duty they had not performed. They awaited the inevitable, the guttural shouts, the casual brutality, the violation that was the promised wage of defeat. They were prepared for pain. They were not prepared for what came next. The sound that heralded their approach was not the demonic roar they had been taught to expect, but something far more unnerving, the rhythmic, confident crunch of heavy boots on gravel. It was an orderly sound, a sound of immense, unhurried power. Then they emerged from the shimmering heat haze. The American Marines tasked with escorting them to the transport ship were not beasts. They were giants. The camera would pan slowly across the women's faces, capturing the minute flicker of confusion in their downcast eyes. Their gaze, meant to be fixed on the ground in shame, involuntarily rises, drawn by a reality so alien it defies belief. They moved with a languid grace, their bodies not twisted into monstrous forms, but straight and tall, impossibly so. Their shoulders were broad, their limbs long and corded, with a muscle born not of desperate struggle, but of abundant nourishment. They towered over the Japanese men who had been their guards and soldiers, themselves now prisoners, who seemed shrunken and brittle in comparison. The American skin, exposed by rolled-up sleeves, was not the pasty white of cellar dwellers, but tanned by the same sun that had baked the Japanese into exhaustion. It was clean, impossibly clean. There was no grime etched into their knuckles, no film of dust matting their hair. Their uniforms, though simple khaki, were crisp and unfaded, their boots polished to a dull gleam despite the pervasive dust. It was an affront, a calculated display of a world without scarcity. And then there were their faces. This was the most profound, the most destabilizing shock. The faces were not the leering masks of propaganda posters. They were symmetrical. The jaws were square, the teeth were straight and shockingly white. The eyes were clear under brows that weren't contorted in rage. Some were so young, their faces smooth and open, possessing a kind of guileless handsomeness they had only ever seen in the flickering images of foreign cinema, a world as distant and fanciful as a fairy tale. They looked, to the women's reeling minds, like film stars. They carried their rifles not as extensions of a savage will, but with a casual, almost bored proficiency, like a carpenter holding a familiar tool. There was no menace in their posture, only a quiet, unshakable confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. The chasm between the expected monster and the observed man was so vast, so immediate, that it created a vertigo of the soul. Their entire worldview, the bedrock of their identity, and their sacrifice, began to crack under the weight of this one simple, incomprehensible observation. They were not being guarded by demons, they were being guarded by gods, or something terrifyingly close. But this initial perception was quickly dismissed as a trick, a clever form of psychological warfare. These could not be ordinary soldiers. They had to be a special unit, an honor guard selected for their appearance, paraded before the defeated to sow despair. If you find this exploration of wartime psychology compelling, subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon. You won't want to miss our next deep dive into the hidden histories of the 20th century. The transport ship was the next stage in this elaborate deception, or so they thought. It was a vessel of staggering proportions, a floating island of gray steel that smelled not of rust and bilge water, but of paint, oil, and a faint clean scent of disinfectant. As they were led up the gangplank, the women kept their heads bowed, expecting a shove, a curse. Instead, they felt a strange absence of aggression. The hands that occasionally guided them were firm but not rough. The voices that gave orders were calm, resonant, and spoken in a language that sounded less like the guttural barks of beasts and more like a rolling, incomprehensible river. The camera follows a single pair of worn Zori sandals shuffling up the metal ramp, contrasting them with the immaculate, heavy combat boots of the guard walking alongside. The sound design emphasizes this contrast. The soft, scraping sound of the sandals against the loud, solid thud of the boots. The interior of the ship was a labyrinth of clean, painted corridors, lit by bare, steady electric bulbs. It was a world of order and function, a stark contrast to the makeshift, crumbling bunkers and tunnels they had just left behind. They were led into a large, ventilated compartment. It was Spartan, filled with rows of simple bunks, each with a neatly folded gray blanket and a thin mattress. But it was clean. The floor was swabbed, the air was fresh, moved by unseen fans. Compared to the crowded, disease-ridden holds of their own transport ships, where soldiers and civilians were packed like cattle in suffocating heat, this was a palace. A medical officer, another tall American with kind eyes behind spectacles, came to inspect them. He moved with a gentle professionalism, his hands surprisingly soft as he checked for wounds or signs of fever. A Japanese-American interpreter, a Nisei whose presence was another source of profound confusion, translated his questions in a flat, neutral tone. The women answered in monosyllables, their minds reeling. This humane, systematic processing of prisoners felt more alien than the prospect of a summary execution. They were being treated not as spoils of war, but as something else, cargo, problems to be managed. This detached, bureaucratic kindness was more disorienting than cruelty. Cruelty they understood. This they did not. It was a procedure, efficient and impersonal, and that in itself was terrifying. It spoke of a system so vast and well-resourced that it could afford to be humane to its most hated enemies. The first meal was the breaking point for many. They were given metal trays, the kind they had seen in photographs of factories or schools. On the trays were portions of food that defied comprehension. There was a slice of white bread, soft and pillowy, next to a small pat of yellow butter. There was a piece of meat, beef, they thought, from the smell, in a thick brown gravy. There were boiled potatoes and a scoop of green peas, and there was a mug of hot, dark liquid that smelled rich and sweet. Coffee with sugar and milk already mixed in. To women who had subsisted for months on watery rice gruel, occasional slivers of pickled radish, and the gnawing emptiness of starvation, this was a feast of kings. Their first instinct was suspicion. It was poisoned. It had to be. This was the final cruel trick, to be killed not by a bullet, but by a mockery of kindness. They watched each other, a silent pact of resistance passing between them. They would not eat. They would die with the dignity of their ancestors, untouched by the enemy's tainted offerings. But hunger is a primal, relentless force. As the hours passed, the aroma of the food filled the compartment, a sweet torture that gnawed at their resolve. A few of the younger ones, their bodies wasted and their willpower eroded by weeks of deprivation, finally succumbed, picking at the bread with trembling fingers. They ate slowly, cautiously, waiting for the first pangs of poison. Nothing happened. The bread was delicious. The meat was tender. The coffee was a jolt of warmth and energy they had not felt in years. One by one, the others began to eat, their movements stiff with shame and ravenous hunger. They ate with their heads down, hiding the tears that welled in their eyes. The tears were not of gratitude. They were tears of a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. Every bite was an admission of defeat. Every swallow was a confirmation of their enemy's unimaginable wealth. This was not a special meal for honored guests. As the days turned into weeks on the long voyage across the Pacific, they learned that this was just food. The crew ate this way every day. The guards, the sailors, the officers. They all ate this bread, this meat, this butter. It was normal, and the normality of it was the most shocking revelation of all. Their own soldiers, the pride of the empire, were starving in the jungles, their bodies racked with beriberi and dysentery, while their enemies ate like lords as a matter of routine. The propaganda had been a lie. Not just a small lie, but a lie of cosmic proportions. The foundation of their world was not just cracked, it was sand. And they soon discovered this wasn't an isolated display on a single ship. It was the unthinking, effortless standard of an entire military, an entire nation. Enjoying this narrative? Share this video with a friend who appreciates history that goes beyond the battlefield, into the minds of those who lived it. The journey became a long, monotonous crucible of cognitive dissonance. The initial theory of a special propaganda unit dissolved with each changing of the guard. The new sailors who came on duty were cast from the same impossible mold, tall, healthy, well-fed. They moved about the ship with an easy confidence, performing their duties with a practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. The camera focuses on a group of sailors swabbing the deck. They are laughing, shirtless in the sun, their bodies lean and muscular. The shot is framed from the perspective of the Japanese women, watching through a porthole, their faces pale and unseen in the shadows. The women watch them for hours, their observation a mixture of fear, fascination, and a burgeoning, shameful envy. The Americans worked hard, but they did not seem to suffer. They were not driven by a fanatical, desperate fury. Their strength was casual, a natural resource they possessed in abundance, like the endless blue water surrounding them. They would sometimes smile at the women, not leeringly, but with a kind of detached, friendly curiosity, as one might smile at a strange bird. Some would offer sticks of chewing gum or chocolate bars, holding them out with an open palm, expecting nothing in return. These small gestures were monumental events, each one a chisel chipping away at the stone facade of their indoctrination. A piece of chocolate, a luxury not seen in Japan for years, even by the wealthy, was given away freely by a common sailor. The act was incomprehensible. It spoke of a world where such treasures were so common they could be discarded without a thought. The internal comparisons became a constant, silent torment. They remembered their brothers, fathers, and husbands, the soldiers of the emperor. They remembered their faces, tight with hunger and strain, their bodies growing thinner and harder, until they seemed to be made of little more than bone and will. They remembered the fierce, burning light in their eyes, the light of a spirit that believed it could conquer a world of material. And now they saw that it was not a fair fight. It was never a fair fight. They had sent men with swords of spirit against men who drove steel behemoths and ate meat every day. The thought was a heresy, a betrayal of everything they had been taught to hold sacred. But it was also an undeniable physical truth, paraded before them with every meal, with every confident stride of their captors. The feeling of racial and spiritual superiority, the core of their Yamato Damashi, began to curdle into a sick feeling of inferiority. They felt like ghosts, pale and insubstantial, haunting a world of giants. They had prided themselves on their cleanliness, their ritual purity. But here they were, lice-ridden and dirty in their tattered clothes, while their barbarian captors smelled of soap and shaved every morning with fresh razor blades. They had prided themselves on their discipline, yet the Americans' discipline was effortless, born of confidence, not of fear. The women began to withdraw into themselves, the communal bonds of shared suffering fraying under the strain of individual psychological collapse. They rarely spoke to one another. What was there to say? To acknowledge the truth aloud would be to give it a power that was too terrible to confront. So they sat in silence, lost in their own internal maelstroms. The nurse, Hanako, would watch the American medic organize his supplies, Endless rolls of white gauze, bottles of antiseptic, gleaming steel instruments. She thought of her own desperate efforts to save men with nothing but rags and boiled water. She felt a wave of professional despair so profound it threatened to drown her. The clerk, Yuki, who had once painstakingly copied patriotic slogans, now found the words turning to ash in her memory. She tried to cling to the idea of the emperor's divinity, of Japan's sacred mission, but these concepts felt thin and brittle against the overwhelming, solid reality of the American war machine. A machine that could afford to be kind, that could waste chocolate on its prisoners. The young girl, Aiko, who had dreamed of dying for her country, now found herself watching a young sailor with blonde hair and blue eyes, who would sometimes juggle oranges on the deck. She did not feel hatred. She felt a vast, aching confusion. He seemed not a soldier, but a boy from a world where one could be so carefree as to play with one's food. The very foundations of her identity were eroding, washed away by a relentless tide of quiet, overwhelming evidence. The true nature of their defeat was not found in the roar of cannons or the flash of bombs, but in the silent, crushing weight of a chocolate bar offered by a handsome giant. This is a story few have ever heard. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be told, support our work by hitting the like button. It helps us reach a wider audience. The psychological unraveling was gradual, an erosion rather than an explosion. It happened in the quiet moments, watching the sailors mend a torn sail with a steady, unhurried competence, listening to their laughter drift over the railings at night, a sound utterly alien in its lack of desperation. Seeing an officer gently reprimand a young seaman, his tone corrective but not cruel. Each of these moments was a small drop of water on stone, and over the weeks of the voyage the stone of their convictions was worn away. They started to observe their captors not as a monolithic entity of the enemy, but as individuals. There was the tall, quiet one who always took the midnight watch and would sometimes stare out at the moon with a look of profound homesickness on his face. There was the stocky, cheerful one who was always whistling and who, they learned from the interpreter, had a wife and 2 young daughters back in a place called Ohio. There was the serious, bookish one who spent his off-duty hours reading a worn paperback. They were not monsters. They were men. This realization, simple as it was perhaps the most terrifying of all. If they were just men, then the chasm of power and resources between their nations was not a matter of divine will or spiritual destiny. It was a simple, brutal, and measurable fact. They had been led into a war they could never have won, a war against a people they did not understand in the slightest. The sense of shame intensified, transforming from a personal feeling of dishonor at being captured into a vast collective humiliation for their nation. How could their leaders have been so blind? How could they have so catastrophically misjudged their enemy? The propaganda had not just been a tool to inspire the populace, it had been a self-inflicted blindness, a fantasy that had led an entire country to the brink of annihilation. The women looked at their own thin wrists, their sallow skin, the haunted look in each other's eyes. They were the products of a system that demanded everything and gave back nothing but hollow slogans and an honorable death. And they were now the wards of a system that seemed to demand little but competence, and in return provided a life of such material ease that it beggared the imagination. They began to feel a deep, burning anger, but its target was no longer the enemy standing guard over them. It was diffuse, aimed at their own generals, their own politicians, their own teachers, everyone who had fed them the glorious lies. The humiliation was total. It was not just a military defeat or an economic one. It was a defeat of the spirit, a defeat of a whole way of seeing the world. The Americans did not need to break their spirits with torture and intimidation. Their very existence, their casual, well-fed, confident existence, was enough to do the job. The journey across the endless, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean became a metaphor for their own internal voyage. They had left a small, isolated island of belief and were being transported across a vast, terrifying ocean of truth toward a continent of reality they could not yet imagine. The thrumming of the ship's engines was a constant reminder of the relentless forward momentum of their new fate. There was no going back. The world they had known was gone forever, sunk beneath the waves of a history that was not written by their gods. They spent their days in a listless daze, the shock having given way to a profound, bone-deep weariness. The good food no longer felt like a trick, but it also brought no joy. It was simply fuel, a means of keeping them alive for a purpose they could not fathom. They were ghosts at a banquet, consuming the substance of a world they did not belong to. The past was a nightmare of fire and starvation. The future was a terrifying blank. All they had was this disorienting present, a floating purgatory between two worlds where handsome, clean-shaven giants offered them chocolate and treated them with a kindness that felt like the cruelest judgment of all. They were no longer prisoners of the American military. They were prisoners of a reality so overwhelming it had obliterated their own. What happens when a nation's core beliefs collide with undeniable truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. The climax of this psychological demolition was not an event, but a sight. It came in the cool, gray light of dawn after weeks at sea. A change in the air, a new smell on the wind, a scent of land, but not the loamy, tropical smell of their islands. This was different, tinged with coal smoke and something vast and green. The interpreter told them to come up on deck. They shuffled out into the morning chill, blinking in the new light. And then they saw it. The camera pulls back from the women's stunned faces to reveal what they are seeing. A panoramic, breathtaking shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, its iconic red-orange towers piercing a low-lying bank of fog. The city of San Francisco is visible behind it, a sprawling panorama of hills and buildings, untouched and serene. It was a structure of such impossible scale and grace that it seemed to belong to the realm of mythology. The Golden Gate Bridge. It was not a military fortification, not a monument to a god-emperor. It was a road, a simple, functional, breathtakingly beautiful road, built with a confidence and artistry that was staggering. The sheer amount of steel, of engineering, of human ingenuity required to sling that ribbon of asphalt across the churning mouth of the bay was beyond their comprehension. It was a casual, everyday miracle, a testament to a power so profound it didn't even feel the need to boast. As the ship sailed under the bridge, the city itself came into view. It was not a city of paper houses and narrow, crowded lanes. It was a metropolis of stone and glass, climbing the hills with an effortless geometry. There were no bombed-out shells of buildings, no rubble-strewn streets, no columns of smoke tainting the sky. The city was whole. It was pristine. It was normal. And that normality was the most devastating weapon of all. They saw cars, thousands of them, a river of gleaming metal and color, moving along the waterfront. In Japan, civilian cars had become a distant memory, all metal and fuel, long since requisitioned for the war. Here they were as common as bicycles. They saw people on the sidewalks, civilians, men in suits and women in bright dresses, walking with a purpose and energy that spoke of a life untouched by privation. The war that had consumed the women's entire world, that had cost them their homes, their families, and their futures, was, for these people, a distant headline in a newspaper, a job in a factory, a son overseas. It had not touched them here. The sheer, unassailable prosperity of it all was a final, crushing blow. It was in this moment that the symbolic shift occurred. The tall, handsome soldiers, the clean ship, the abundant food, they were not individual anomalies. They were symptoms. They were the products of this place, this civilization. A civilization so wealthy, so technologically advanced, so organizationally brilliant that it could project its power across the largest ocean on the planet, wage a total war on two fronts, and its homeland would remain a paradise of gleaming cars and colossal, beautiful bridges. The American soldiers were not a special breed of men. They were simply what this country produced. They were tall and healthy, because the nation had enough food to feed all its sons. They were confident, because they came from a place of unshakable strength. They were handsome and clean because they lived in a world that had the luxury of aesthetics, of hygiene, of individualism. The women's indoctrination had taught them that the Americans were spiritually hollow, a culture of decadent materialists. But as they looked upon the city of San Francisco, they understood. Their spirit their Yamato Damashi, had been a beautiful, desperate, suicidal gamble. The Americans hadn't needed a superior spirit. They had steel, they had oil, they had wheat fields and factories and a continent of resources, and they had built a world with it. The war had not been a contest of wills. It had been an industrial calculation, and their side had been a rounding error. The sight of the Golden Gate Bridge did not inspire hope or wonder. It inspired a silence more profound than any they had yet experienced. It was the silence of a final, irrevocable understanding. The war was over, not because they had been outfought, but because they had been outproduced, outorganized, outimagined. Their entire worldview, their sense of themselves and their place in the world, had been built on a foundation of myth. And now, they were sailing directly into the heart of the reality that had crushed that myth to dust. The bridge was not just a bridge, it was a symbol. It was a tombstone for the Japan they had known. And as they passed under its shadow, they felt the last vestiges of their old selves die, leaving behind a hollow space filled with a terrible, silent awe. The final piece of their identity, the belief in their own nation's fundamental virtue, had just been obliterated by the casual grandeur of a civilian bridge. This journey of discovery is far from over. Subscribe now to continue exploring the pivotal moments that have shaped our modern world. The legacy of this profound shock was not something that could be measured in the immediate aftermath, in the processing centers, or the POW camps where they spent the remainder of the war. It was a seed planted in the fertile ground of their shattered beliefs, a seed that would grow and blossom in the strange, new world of post-war Japan. In the camps, the routine of abundance continued. They were given clean clothes, regular meals, medical care, and even classes to learn English. The guards, a mix of army soldiers now, were much the same as the sailors had been, generally professional, detached, and products of that same world of inexplicable plenty. The initial shock had numbed into a state of quiet, passive observation. The women learned to navigate this new reality, but they never grew accustomed to it. The memory of the transport ship, of the first meal, of the sight of San Francisco, became a kind of internal touchstone, a permanent marker separating the world before from the world after. When they were finally repatriated to a Japan that was a landscape of ashes and ruin, the contrast was more stark and painful than ever. They returned to a nation of starving, demoralized people, living in shacks amidst the rubble of their cities. They saw the hollowed-out faces of their countrymen, the desperation in their eyes, and they understood the true cost of the great lie they had all been told. But unlike their peers, who had only experienced the brutal reality of defeat, these women carried within them a second, equally powerful vision, the vision of the victor's world. They had seen what was possible. They had seen a nation not broken by war, but strengthened by it. This secret knowledge set them apart. It was a burden, but it was also a strange kind of gift. While others wrestled with the shame of military failure, these women wrestled with a much more fundamental crisis, the failure of their entire culture's perception of reality. They had seen the other side, and they could never unsee it. In the years that followed, as Japan began its own economic miracle, rebuilding itself from the rubble with a frantic, focused energy, the memories of these women became a private, unspoken history. They married, raised children, and grew old in a new Japan that was rapidly transforming itself, in many ways, in the image of its former enemy. When they saw the first Japanese department stores filled with goods, when they saw the first highways stretching between reconstructed cities, when they saw their own children growing taller and healthier than their generation had ever been, they felt a strange echo of their past. They recognized the blueprint. They understood, on a visceral level, that others could not, where this new road was leading. Their experience had given them a unique and often painful perspective on their country's journey. They knew what it was to be on the other side of that chasm of power, and they understood the desperate national urgency to close that gap. They watched the rise of a new, prosperous Japan with a mixture of pride and a quiet, lingering sorrow. They were proud of the recovery, but they could never forget the profound, soul-shaking revelation that had necessitated it. The image of the tall, handsome American soldier, a figure that should have been a monster of hate, had instead become an unwilling agent of enlightenment. He was not a demon. He was a harbinger. He was a living, breathing symbol of a world they had to understand in order to survive. He represented a power that was not spiritual, but material, a strength that was not fanatical, but organizational. And in the silent, crowded theater of their memories, he remained a permanent fixture, the film star in a soldier's uniform, whose simple, well-fed existence had been enough to topple an empire, not with a sword, but with a smile and a bar of chocolate. This experience, seared into their minds, became a quiet, unwritten chapter in the story of the Pacific War, a testament to the fact that the most decisive battles are not always fought with guns, but with the collision of realities, and that sometimes the most potent weapon of all is a truth so overwhelming it leaves no room for lies. The war ended for them not with the Emperor's broadcast, but in the moment they realized their demons were just men, and that those men had built a better world. We've reached the end of this incredible story. If it moved you or made you think, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support allows us to produce more in-depth historical documentaries like this one.